Hello everybody and welcome to this latest webinar in our series of Basis Technologies webinars on DevOps and test automation and all related issues in the world of SAP. As you can see on the screen, today we're going to be looking at a beginner's guide to Agile development for SAP. So really a high-level look at some of the concepts and implications around adopting Agile development in your SAP environments. We'll talk a bit more about the details in a moment. Before we do, just a little bit of webinar admin as always. To begin, everybody on the call is on mute today, pretty standard in these things, but if you do have any questions, do please enter those into the question panel, into your GoToWebinar control panel there, and I'll try to get through those at the end of the session if we can, and if not, of course, we'll come back to you offline after the webinar finishes. We're aiming to run for about probably 40 to 45 minutes in today's session. This is a recorded webinar, as always, with our Basis Technologies webinars, so everybody who's registered will receive a link to the webinar in a day or two. If you don't see that and you'd like to get it, you want to get that link to play back the recording, do please get in touch and let us know. Probably through our website would be the easiest way. So let's get started with today's webinar. As I've said, we're looking at a beginner's guide to Agile development for SAP. My name's Peter Yabsley. I'm the head of product marketing here at Basis Technologies, and I'm not a developer. I'm not going to put my hand up here and say that I'm a technical SAP expert, but what I have spent the last few years doing is talking to our customers about the challenges they face and how they want to change the way they manage their SAP systems and develop and deliver code, and why Agile development has been an approach that they've considered and in many cases adopted, and what that's done for them. And I'm going to talk through some of those high-level questions and issues today. So here's our agenda. You'll have seen roughly this when you signed up for the webinar, but this is what I'm going to take us through in the presentation. We're just going to start with the big picture, first of all, of why this is such a relevant topic, particularly today, and what we mean by Agile development, and why that's a positive approach for many organizations today in SAP. We'll look briefly at some different Agile frameworks, some of the different approaches that you can take to this topic. And I'm going to spotlight a little bit on some key aspects of one of those, which is Scrum, the one probably that we see most often with our clients. And I'm going to finish up today's presentation with a real-world example of a Basis Technologies customer who's adopted Agile development very successfully in their SAP environments. Just before we begin, for those of you who may not be so familiar with Basis Technologies or why we're here today talking about Agile development in SAP, a quick introduction to us as a company. We create software automation that helps our customers to change the way they run and manage, maintain and adapt their SAP systems by bringing things like Agile and DevOps into those SAP environments through our DevOps and test automation platform, which very importantly is specifically engineered for the needs of SAP. And I'm not going to get too much into any technical details today, but we will touch on a couple of areas why that's really important. And it very much applies to anything in the DevOps and Agile space in SAP that you want bespoke and specific tools to support you. We've been around for nearly 25 years now, founded in 1997, as you can see. So a really deep well of SAP expertise within our team around the world in our global offices. So I'm talking to you today from London in the UK, but we also have offices in North America, Australia and mainland Europe. And that's because, as you can see, we have very much a global base of clients across all kinds of industries, but the common thread is that they're all SAP users who are looking to get the benefits of automation within those systems, and we, of course, support them in doing that. And the way that we principally do that is through these two products which make up our DevOps and test automation platform. So Active Control is our change and release automation solution, so effectively your CI/CD stack for within SAP, and Testimony is a quite unique regression testing solution that we have that really does away with the need for traditional test scripts in your regression testing phase. So I just mention these now because there's going to be a couple of moments later on where I talk about some specific areas around automation, and active control is certainly going to come up there as part of that conversation. So let's begin, as I said, with the high level, with the big picture. I'm sure this slide is telling many or all of you what you already know, but there's this question of why we should even be considering changing the way we approach development and delivery in SAP systems. And it's fundamentally because the world is changing around us. The world has changed around us. Everything is much more digital now, whether that's products or services or interactions. Everything is moving at a faster pace, in part because of that digitization. And so we see that in terms of our competition, we see it in terms of market dynamics, we see it in terms of customer expectations. And SAP, as a system that supports our business, really needs to enable the business to respond more quickly to those kind of changes. But our traditional, slow, monolithic way of doing things can't provide that agility and responsiveness that really our businesses demand today. You know, 6-monthly SAP release cycles for new features, which was common among Basis Technologies customers until very recently, and it's still something that we come across, really doesn't fit the bill in today's digital economy. But although SAP can be sometimes somewhat isolated, you know, it's a complex system, but one that can work sometimes fairly independently. In many cases, it's more and more connected to the rest of the business. And the concept we're going to talk about today, Agile Development, has been around quite a long while. I'll touch on that in a moment. And it's quite widely adopted amongst other IT teams who are working in different technologies on different applications. And it may be that they're ready to move at high speed and respond to those market changes. But if they're dependent on SAP and SAP can't do the same, then it's going to be SAP that is holding the business back in certain areas from making those adaptations and meeting customer demands. And actually, we see this with the clients we speak to more and more, as much as in the sense of that it's a risk, as that it's actually happening today, but they recognize it could be an issue, and they want to connect those systems up and align the way that they're developing across different applications. And we'll very much see that in the case study example at the end of today's presentation. And, you know, those are kind of general statements that I'm sure nobody on the call would be surprised to hear, but some validation of that in a recent article actually from McKinsey, where they were looking at larger scale ERP transformations. But of course, this would apply to big SAP projects as much as anything else. And they concluded that 75% of those ERP transformations fail to stay on schedule or on budget. So we're late and we're over time. And then there are a number of reasons for that. Some of the key challenges that McKinsey identified are on the screen here. And one of those is certainly the traditional waterfall methodology, which is specifically called out as a limiting factor, but also things like insufficient integration between the business and IT, or not enough focus on delivery of business value as opposed to technical execution. And it's Agile Development that helps us to solve for these kind of things, both in those big ERP transformations, but also on an ongoing basis as you're delivering BAU change, business as usual change, or smaller pieces of work or smaller projects. So where does Agile come from? What are we talking about when we say Agile Development? As I said, it's been around for a long time now. Arguably since the 1990s, many people would peg it in the 1990s with the creation of ideas like extreme programming as a new approach to software development. But very often, the kind of line in the sand, the recognized beginning of widespread adoption of Agile as a concept in software development teams is seen as the creation of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development in 2001. And that was a very simple, actually, document. If you haven't come across it before, you can still find it at agilemanifesto.org, and a pleasingly old-fashioned website. And that was something that a small group of software engineers set out. They wrote this document to try and define a framework for what they saw as a better way of doing software development than the traditional old-fashioned approach. And in that, they set out 4 values and 12 principles that, as I said, set a framework, set the scene for how they felt software development should be approached. And I'm not going to go through all of those today. I certainly would recommend taking a look at both those values and principles on that site, because they really set the expectation for the mindset of Agile. But I just wanted to call out the 4 values on the screen here, because I think they emphasize some of the understanding we sometimes come across with SAP Teams when we're talking about Agile development, because these are absolutely not black and white. As I said, it's a framework, it's adaptable, it's flexible, it should be made to, the approach you take should be made to fit your business. So when we talk about things like working software over comprehensive documentation, that doesn't mean we don't create documentation for our SAP systems and the changes we're delivering. Of course we need to. You know, they're business critical. We're talking about business processes. We're often subject to regulatory requirements. Of course we're going to document it. It's how we document. Perhaps rather than creating a complete design blueprint and all of the associated documentation before we start writing any code, for example, in our project, we can break that down and do it in smaller chunks and more iterative ways, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Again, responding to change over following a plan is one of the values. It doesn't mean we don't plan if we do Agile for SAP. It means we need to shift our mindset and start looking at how we do that in a different way. But I think the important point as well is that as we often see, SAP is slightly different architecturally, culturally from maybe the rest of the IT world, and we can adapt things like Agile development to fit what we need in an SAP world. So to kind of summarize those ideas on what the Agile Manifesto is broadly trying to get across, we're trying to move away from that left-hand side, that waterfall development that McKinsey highlighted as a real limitation, where we've got pre-planned large phases of work that we're completing on a sequential basis, where we don't actually deliver anything, we don't deliver any value until a long way through the process, when a lot of time's gone by and we've potentially invested a lot of money. What we're trying to do with Agile is take a more adaptive, collaborative approach, more customer-centric approach, actually, and that's really important, where we have more iterative units of work that deliver value more quickly so that we can respond to feedback more quickly and more easily create a more effective end product. And you know, this kind of image here, of course, gives the impression, the indication that it's all about breaking everything down into tiny chunks and delivering them to production one by one. And of course, in many cases, we can strive for that, and it's often achievable, actually. But within SAP, of course, we've got to recognize that there will be big projects sometimes that are complex, that have interdependencies that we need to plan at a higher level. But even then, we can still potentially take a more agile approach to work within those projects and break it down into smaller units that we can deliver to internal customers perhaps more quickly, so that we can get feedback and run our project more efficiently. So Agile can be used in, let's say, a kind of normal Agile sense in SAP, and I'll show an example of that at the end, but it also can be a way to address those larger projects in a more flexible and cost-effective and efficient way. And what kind of benefits do the organizations that we work with at Basis Technology see coming out of this adoption of Agile for SAP? Why is it on the agenda? Well, I've mentioned value already, and that's really key to the whole idea. What we're trying to do is get development teams to deliver working software on a more frequent basis, so we get value from that, and the customer or the end user gets value from that more quickly. So it's really a fundamental concept of Agile. Theoretically, what it's also going to help us do is mitigate the uncertainty of very long-term, large IT projects. We don't know what's going to happen in the project or in the world over the next 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. There's no way we can really predict that effectively. And so that makes it difficult for us to make accurate plans. And taking an Agile approach gives us the responsiveness to react to changes in circumstance if unexpected things do happen during the period of that work across a longer time period. And those smaller units of change that I've talked about, they have a double benefit in terms of impact on your live systems. First of all, you've got your business users, and that 6-monthly SAP production deployment that I talked about, in the old-fashioned way of doing things, that's potentially a huge amount of change that could have a huge impact on the way your business users are working today, what they need to learn, and what maybe they need to be trained on. So if we're delivering smaller units of change, that's going to be easier for them to adapt to. And of course, from a technical perspective, there's simply less that can go wrong if we're delivering smaller units of work at one time rather than everything in one go. Very important concept in Agile as well, which I'll come on to in a later slide, is the idea of prioritization and being able to make sure that what we're delivering is relevant to the people who need it. I'm sure there's people on the call today, I know it's certainly true for some of my colleagues who've had the experience of working on big pieces of development in SAP systems over months or even years, and then finding that when they're actually delivered to the intended end users, they're either not quite what was asked for in the first place, or they're no longer needed because circumstances have changed. So with an Agile approach, we should be able to constantly reprioritize the work that we've got waiting for us in order that we can stay more relevant and deliver more value to our end users. Again, Agile should help us to get a better idea of spend and how we're staying on budget. And again, this is probably more relevant to that project scenario, to the bigger pieces of work. But as we're going along and delivering discrete units from end to end, we can see what we've invested in those incrementally as we go along, rather than having to wait for entire phases of project work to be completed and for that change to be delivered before we can really see what the cost and the impact was. Also, an interesting concept you might sometimes hear around this in the Agile world is the idea of salvage value. If you have to, for some reason, pull the plug on that larger project, a larger piece of work, or make substantive changes to the original intention, if you haven't deployed anything in your waterfall model, you might potentially be writing off all of the investment that you've made because you're never going to get any output. Whereas with an Agile model, hopefully we've been able to actually deliver some working software, some units of value. So even if we have to make big changes, we've still got some value from the investment that we've put in. And overall, with the increased collaboration, with the smaller units of output that we're working to, hopefully Agile should give us increased visibility as well into the status of software development and the progress that we're making. And that could be particularly important within SAP systems, which we often hear described as things like a black box. Even from the SAP teams who are using them, they recognize that challenge in communicating to the rest of the business the progress that they're making. So those are some of the outcomes and reasons why our customers are adopting Agile development. How can you go about it? Agile development, as I've said, is not a defined checklist of things to do and a set of rules to follow. At a high level, that manifesto provides a good framework. And then since that was created, there have been a number of different methodologies that have been defined, which suggest different approaches to Agile and different ways to work. And the three most common ones that we come across, and arguably possibly the three most common types generally in software development, are the ones that you can see on your screen here. So we've got Kanban, we've got Scrum, and we've got the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe. So Kanban, starting on the left, possibly the most common and widely recognized illustration of Agile development. Those post-it notes on a wall or on a board or on a digital screen these days, moving along from column to column as work gets done. So Kanban is derived from physical manufacturing processes, assembly lines in factories originally in the Toyota production system. And it's all about continuous flow. It's having about a list of tasks waiting, being pulled one by one into work in progress, and executed in a continuous manner. And one of the key things about Kanban is that work in progress is strictly limited. So the resources that you have, in our case for software development, are only targeted at a certain amount of work at a given time. And once that capacity is reached, no other work can be added until the current work is completed. So it forces you to get stuff out the door and not have a big stack of shelfware work in progress. Secondly, we've got Scrum. Now, Scrum is probably the most widely adopted version of Agile that we see in the SAP world with our clients. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because it's slightly more structured. It's a more time-boxed approach with a defined amount of work. So it has a kind of project feel to it. And also because of the nature of it, because of that kind of structure, we can more easily fit it into bigger projects in defined phases than perhaps a Kanban approach. So I'm going to talk about Scrum and some of the key concepts that you'll need to think about if you want to adopt Scrum in a bit more detail in a moment. And then scaled Agile framework, I want to mention here because particularly as people who work in the world of SAP, often in big enterprises, across large complex IT systems, you're the kind of audience that may come across this idea. So SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, SAFe, is a quite highly structured approach to adopting Agile across an enterprise. And you can do it at multiple different layers and multiple different scales. The kind of small diagram you can see there really gives the sense of the overall enterprise-wide application of SAFe. And it tends to be adopted more by those big companies who want to standardize an approach to Agile throughout their organization and not only at the development layer. So we're talking about things like organizational planning and budgeting so that you can align those kind of exercises with the way your actual IT teams are working. And that way, potentially you avoid scenarios like still working to annual budget cycles that don't align with short iterative units of work that your IT teams are actually executing in a way they're adapting and changing their plans on a regular basis. We don't come across SAFe that often, to be honest, but we do sometimes see it in larger organizations. And as you can see on the screen there, it's kind of a mixed approach. You'll see Scrum, you'll see Kanban in there, you'll see some elements of continuous delivery, you'll see Lean in there. So SAFe is a more overarching model for those organizations who really want to go all in on Agile and be quite standardized. But of course, as I've said, there's adaptation here. We've got to fit these things to what we need in SAP. So for example, in Basis Technologies, we actually employ both Kanban and Scrum for different purposes in our organization and our SAP development. So our support tickets and bug fixes are run more on a Kanban basis because you can't really predict what's going to come in there and you may need to reprioritize very rapidly. So the team there uses Kanban to address that continuous flow of customer support. Whereas for our new feature development, we tend to use Scrum because we can define what work we want to do in the periods associated with Scrum, and we can do that in a slightly more structured way, leading towards our regular product releases. You may even see as well, you may come across the term Scrumban. That's another approach again to adopting Agile, and that's a combination obviously of the two, where for example you might use a Kanban board to track and manage your progress through your Scrum process. So different ways that you can come at this, different benefits and different attributes of each. One other that you might come across also, and you might recognize, I just want to mention here because it's quite common in the SAP world, is of course SAP Activate, which is kind of an agile project approach created by SAP principally for SAP implementations. So many phases in Activate. I'm sure some of you have come across it before, but and some of it is quite linear in a more traditional fashion, but that realize phase is intended to be more of an agile project where we do these smaller units of work and try to get feedback more quickly than in an old-fashioned traditional waterfall model. So I just mentioned Activate there because it's kind of potentially a good example of those kind of more agile or water agile fall type projects. We tend not to really come across it in the organizations we're working with, where they're managing their SAP systems on an ongoing basis, and they're already up and running and often have been for many, many years. So let's just take a slightly deeper look at Scrum for the next 10 or 15 minutes, and some of the key concepts that are important for you to be aware of and to think about if you want to adopt this as a way of working in SAP. And these are some of the key things that our customers have been concerned with and ask us about. And first of all, we need to understand the process and the concept of Scrum. And Scrum is based around these things called sprints. And this is where we come back to what I've mentioned multiple times already, where we're breaking our work down into these smaller defined units. So typically our sprints will be anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks long. And we'll have a small team, and I'll talk about the team in a minute, working on a defined amount of work in that 2 to 4 week period in what we call, and the work we've defined and agreed we're going to aim to do is called the sprint backlog. Backlog's quite an important concept in Agile, and I'll talk about it in a bit more detail in a moment. So we've got this 2 to 4 week period. We tend to find our customers and the people working in SAP generally go for the shorter sprints. 2 weeks is more common than 4, I would say, in most of our experience. But again, you can flex that to adapt to your organization. So we have this sprint backlog pulled from the product backlog, and one of the ways we manage that as a team over this short period of time is through daily Scrum meetings, or daily stand-ups as they're called, where everybody gets together every day for a very short meeting to talk about what they're working on, the progress so far in the sprint, and any bottlenecks or barriers that they may have that the team could help them to address. So it's a very collaborative approach with people working together on a daily basis rather than separately in silos. And again, those two things of collaboration and customer centricity in terms of delivering rapidly are very central to this idea, and that also comes through in how we represent our requirements, which is the phrase user stories you can see on the screen here, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides' time. So when we talk about Scrum, we're talking about sprints, and this concept of sprints is very common to Agile development. When we're talking about Agile, we're often talking about sprints as units of work. Team organization, really important change, and not a huge change necessarily for Agile compared with maybe something like DevOps, but is important and needs to happen and needs to be something you think about if you want to adopt Scrum in your SAP team. So in an orthodox traditional Scrum team, there are only 3 roles, but there are more than just developers. So we have developers, but we also have a Scrum Master and a product owner. And the product owner is there to represent the customer, to represent the end user, maybe the business process owner. And it's the product owner that defines the work we're aiming to do. And the Scrum Master is there to facilitate the process and help them make that happen. So the Scrum Master needs to be educated in how Agile works and Agile techniques and be ready to support the team through that. So obviously, as you can see, you've got 3 roles. We need 3 people minimum in a Scrum team, but 3 to 9 is typically considered pretty standard. What we tend to find in SAP is that SAP teams are already a little bit ahead of the game, perhaps by the nature of SAP systems being quite interconnected. And so they commonly include a few more roles. This example on the right is actually from one of our customers, where in their Scrum teams, they also include basis, QA, configurators as required, but they include those as a pretty standard part of the process. So you may want to consider that as well. And of course, individuals can be involved in multiple teams. If you shouldn't look at this and think, well, we're never going to have enough headcount to split our work this way. It is possible for individuals to be involved in multiple teams. And what then happens in a lot of organizations is, as we have separate Scrum teams working on separate bits of development, perhaps in the same area, so perhaps, for example, in the same functional area like finance or supply chain, those Scrum teams are grouped together in what we call tribes, who coordinate together across their Scrums to make sure they have a view of overall what is happening in their functional area and the area that they're working in. So we've talked there about the structure of a Scrum and of the concept of sprints, and how you need to think about team organization. Product backlog is a really important concept of how we define the work we're going to do in our SAP sprint cycle, in our SAP Scrum process. So the ultimate building block of requirements in an Agile process is what's called a user story. And this is a small unit of work that we try and define as what a particular user needs, why they need it, and what outcome they're looking for. And this is one of the key challenges and key mindset changes of adopting Agile, particularly in SAP, is of how we can break down our requirements into those small consumable chunks. And it's a really important aspect because it's doing that and breaking our needs down into those small user stories that lets us constantly reprioritize and focus on the highest priority in each sprint. If we have huge requirements, we can't be responsive and adaptive in that fashion. But of course, we're going to have overarching goals. Many of those individual user stories will ladder up to bigger outcomes, and that's where these ideas you may see of epics or themes and initiatives come in. So different layers of hierarchy, and we might be delivering a certain number of user stories in a sprint, and then we aim to deliver an epic over a certain number of sprints, for example. And we can map this to SAP through things like, SAP have done this themselves in some of their materials. So if you look at the best practices for S/4HANA, you'll see the scope item, for example, of sales maps to a theme. And then we've got things like scope item subgroups like order and contract management we can consider our epic. And then we get down into scope items and key process steps or key process flows. Maybe we're creating a return order as part of that order and contract management subgroup. Those are where our user stories lie, in those key process flows and key process steps. So this is can be challenging, but it's a really important step in approaching an agile methodology within SAP. Typically, a lot of organizations will use tools like the ones on the left there to manage all of their agile user stories, all of their agile requirements in one place: Jira, ServiceNow, Azure DevOps, and so on. What we find is the classic SAP problem that they're not connected to your SAP environment, and there isn't an obvious means to do that. And that's where tools like Active Control, Basis Technologies DevOps product, comes in, because Active Control will allow you to connect all of your SAP development with those user stories stored in your Agile backlog management tool like Jira, so that every single transport you create can be connected to a business requirement completely transparently. And you can manage that all in one place. And just to give you a sense of how those kind of Agile backlog management tools can help you to track progress, these are examples of what's called Burndown Charts. And this is something that's very often used in those daily stand-ups to see how you're progressing in terms of work delivered versus what you expected to do across that sprint cycle. So I'm not going to dig into that now, but Burndown Charts are certainly worth being aware of, and this is one of the reasons why organizations prefer to have all of their requirements in one place, in one tool, so that they can produce this kind of tracking, including their SAP development. And some of you may already have been thinking about one of the big challenges, as I've been talking, of this idea of multiple small autonomous teams potentially working on different bits of development or different outcomes. And that's the challenge in SAP, that we may all be working in the same development environment, in the same code base. This commonly comes up as a question when we're talking to organizations about Agile development in terms of how they might manage this. Because of course, we have, for example, a customer who's looking to implement almost 60 Agile teams across quite a small number of development systems. And if they're not going to be coordinated as one development team, they could all be bashing heads together at any given time. We're going to get those problems that we always see around things like tracking and managing conflicts and overtakes and overwrites and sequencing out transports properly and dependency management and orchestration, all of that kind of stuff. It's potentially amplified when we've got these teams working separately. And that is, again, where automation is really your friend. And this is really one of the key areas where automation enables active control to be enables agile development to be a practical reality. It's quite difficult to manage these kind of things, particularly in SAP, without DevOps automation like active control, not least because you simply don't have a lot of time in each of those sprints to do all this manual work, to track what all the teams are doing, to manage it in spreadsheets, to get it all right. That's hard enough in normal circumstances in a standard SAP release cadence. So automation isn't critical to everything in agile development and SAP, but certainly in this area of managing and coordinating your teams is extremely important. And a final couple of things. This idea of shift left, shifting quality left, it's not always strictly a part of an agile approach, but it's very commonly brought up as part of agile development and as a part of an agile mindset when teams are moving to this way of working, because again, we're in a quite bounded time box situation where we need to make sure that we can deliver in the time we've said we would. So if we're able to concentrate on quality right up front and identify issues and address them as early as possible, that's going to help us to deliver on a higher cadence. And there are some generic ways we can do that, like integrating QA in your Scrum team right from the start, as I've mentioned a couple of slides ago, or things like instigating peer reviews, which are really effective, very relatively simple to implement, making sure there's at least 2 sets of eyes on every piece of code. And then, of course, in SAP, there's some specific tools we can use as well, like ABAP Unit for unit testing, Code Inspector, ABAP Test Cockpit, these kind of things. And again, Active Control or a tool like Active Control can help you to build those things automatically into your development process and ensure that no transports can even move out of dev until those kind of tools and checks have been run and signed off. So just this idea of bringing quality, bringing the QA team as early in the process as possible is not formally part of Agile, but it's often in there and it's a really good thing to consider. And then finally, review and feedback. As I've said, this is very much, Scrum is intended to be an iterative process. So this idea of review and feedback is really important. And I've got 3 elements on the screen here, and one of them isn't officially part of the Scrum process. You wouldn't have seen that on that first sprint cycle slide that I showed, and that's customer playbacks. But at Basis Technologies, we do this internally. We think it's really valuable to show directly some end users or some representative end users what you've actually developed and what you've delivered, and get feedback from them on it once you've finished your sprint. You could, of course, just roll it out, deploy it to production, say, hey, it's changed, and let them get on with it. But if you get that, if you show them how it works, get that feedback directly, that can be a valuable part of the process. Then the 2 more formal elements in a Scrum approach are this sprint review and the sprint retrospective. So the sprint review is all about looking at what work you plan to do, what work you've done, and how successful you were in achieving the goals you had during that particular development cycle. And as part of that, you'll also then look at how you reprioritize your product backlog, the user stories that you've got to do next, and also start thinking about planning for the next sprint. So that's all about what did we actually deliver. The sprint retrospective then is more about how we delivered it and talking about ways to improve the process, whether that's people or processes or tools, but how can we work better? What bottlenecks did we have? What things tripped us up? How can we get past those? What assumptions maybe did we make that we shouldn't have done? So the sprint review will be anywhere between 2 and 4 hours, sprint retrospective no more than 3 hours, and that length really depends on the length of your sprint and the amount of work you've done, but a very important part of the process in SAP as much as anywhere else. Okay, so just getting towards the end, but again, those are some high-level concepts of important things to be aware of and think about if you want to adopt this new, different way of working. If you want to think about how to get started, we've got this kind of suggested checklist of high-level items, and you can see more details about that in our ebook, How to Get Started with Agile for SAP. You can find that on our website. I've covered some of these points today. I think the other one that's just worth calling out maybe is this idea of starting small, because that can often be a really effective way to prove out Agile development in your SAP teams as an effective approach and kind of iron out the kinks as you figure out what works best for you, as I've mentioned at the start, as you adapt Agile to your SAP environment. So yeah, of course, if you're interested to have a look at that ebook, you can find that on our website. So just to wrap things up, as I said at the start now, a short case study just for a couple of minutes of one of our customers who have successfully adopted Agile in their SAP teams, not only in their SAP teams, but across their organization, and that's Vistaprint. So Vistaprint is an organization many of you may be aware of. They've been around for more than 20 years as an e-commerce company now, started really as a purveyor of business cards as much as anything, and now they'll pretty much create you any bespoke marketing material and collateral for your business that you might want. And as you can imagine, SAP is pretty central to their business because it runs their manufacturing and supply chain, and they're pretty much producing on a just-in-time basis, really, because every order is different. Your company is going to order different branded mugs to mine. There's no such thing as stock of those things. So keeping SAP up and running it efficiently and effectively, very important to Vistaprint. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides that actually Vistaprint put together in a presentation with us last year. And I won't go through all the details of this one, but this is the kind of their Agile story, if you like. And it actually started back in 2013 when there was a realization across their business, and it was very much a business-driven shift to Agile as much as a technical one, that they simply weren't as agile as they used to be when they were in their startup phase. They weren't able to roll out new ideas as quickly as they wanted. They weren't able to adapt to the competition or respond to the competition as fast as they wanted because they'd grown into a billion-dollar business, you know. So they implemented an agile approach across a lot of their software teams, and they did that in quite a structured way with management buy-in. So this was more of a kind of a big bang. External coaching to support the teams in making that change. But the big point of the story here really is that, as is often the case, the SAP team and SAP in general wasn't really a part of that initiative because they kind of sat separately from a lot of the rest of the IT teams. But as the benefits of Agile were seen in Vistaprint, it became apparent over some time that they wanted to bring SAP into that fold and align SAP with that approach. And they started to do that in 2017 when they started to work with Basis Technologies to support them in that change in their SAP environments. And at Vistaprint, they took a three-step process. They defined it as a three-step process in SAP, which again connects to a lot of those things that I've just talked about. So they started very much with the people. More than anywhere else in their IT teams, probably their SAP teams knew the least about Agile, were the least familiar with these kind of concepts. So they took the time to educate people on the changes that needed to be made in team structure and ways of working and the benefits that will come out of that. And that's where some of those Agile coaches and external resources really helped them, for example. So again, they were really recognizing there that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach with particularly with the people element of this, and they adapted their approach and tried to support their SAP teams in understanding the change they wanted to make as a key part of their process. And once they started to reform their organization slightly and make those different Scrum teams, individual teams that I talked about earlier, they did take that approach in Vistaprint of forming tribes of different functions. So as I mentioned, Agile, supply chain, finance, analytics, those kind of different areas. Then in terms of process, they said, okay, well, what do we want to get to? What's our goal? And Vistaprint's goal was 2-week sprint cycles with the potential for daily releases to production. So that means that if they could do that, they wouldn't have to align all of their sprints on the same dates. The teams could work, again, autonomously in the way that was needed. And as soon as the sprint finished and the code was ready to go or the changes were ready to go, they could be deployed to production. They wanted to break away from SAP release cycles completely. And so step 3 in making that happen was to adopt active control from Basis Technologies to help them to automate that process and deal with those kind of issues that I talked about earlier, and eliminate the manual effort and the technical complexity that was involved in having multiple individual teams working on different aspects and different bits of work. And that gave them, of course, then a single source of truth for managing that change, and they connected that to their Jira system, which was their central source of truth for all of their Agile development. So it's a 1, 2, 3 at Vistaprint to adopt Agile in SAP, and you can see here on the screen some of the outcomes that they feel that they've got from this approach. So faster, safer, more frequent delivery of SAP change, greater team autonomy, and certainly the basis team have to hold many fewer hands these days, increased productivity across the team because of things like that, and early delivery of value, which, as I mentioned right at the start of the presentation, is really important. As soon as the sprint's finished, as soon as the work is done, with their daily production deployments run through Active Control, they can get that out there and in front of end users and get value for the business. And you can see in the table the kind of benefits that they've actually seen from doing that. So we're up to our 45 minutes, just over. I've been a little bit slow, so let's just summarize and wrap things up of what I've gone through today. I started off by kind of making the statement that old-fashioned waterfall development can be a commercial disadvantage, and although that's not going to be universally true, I think we can agree in many cases it is these days. And it's certainly true that Agile development delivers many benefits within and outside of SAP. Most of the Agile SAP teams that we come across as an organization are adopting Scrum as their approach, but there are other ways you can go. And whichever you choose, you're going to need some kind of new organization as well as new working methods. You're going to need to bring people with you to understand why that's important and how it's going to be effective. SAP specific automation is pretty much essential to help you on this journey and remove that effort and complexity I mentioned to make this a practical approach. And Agile is already developing for SAP teams in organizations like Vistaprint and others around the world. So that's the wrap up from a high level introduction to Agile development for SAP. Thanks very much to everybody for joining us on the call here today. I'll take a look at some Q&A in just a couple of minutes we've got left. But before I do that, if you would like to discuss any more of these concepts in more detail or try and understand how Agile development could work in your business, we'd be more than happy to have that conversation with you or show you how Active Control could help. And if you want to do that, you can get in touch with us via our website. You can see the URL there, or you can contact me directly on my email address. And as I mentioned, this is a recorded session and we will be sharing the link in the next day or two. So if you want to get hold of that to share with anyone else or to watch again, of course, if you don't see it, do please get in touch. So just before we wrap up, just going to try and look at couple of questions. Okay, let's start with a relatively straightforward one. We've got a few questions that have come in here and I've just got a couple of minutes left, so I'll try and address those, and if we can't get to them all, as I said, we'll try and follow up with you offline. What's the difference between Agile and DevOps in SAP is a great question, and one that I haven't addressed at all today because, as I mentioned, I'm already slightly over time and we could get into lots of detail there. But fundamentally, there's a lot of overlap. Agile is very much a part of DevOps. You're pretty much always going to be doing Agile development if you're doing DevOps in SAP or anywhere else. But the Agile part really is traditionally more developer focused. So the clue's kind of in the name. DevOps is Dev and Ops, development and operations, and actually many more functions these days. And it's trying to get through that barrier of, okay, my development team is more agile and working more efficiently, but I can't get that stuff into production and I can't get it live and get the value from it as quickly as I'd like. So DevOps tends to be even more about cross-functional teams. I showed you that example that's kind of maybe halfway there, very much more about automation, even more automation, in some cases, you know, cross-application, automated delivery pipelines, which we can also connect SAP into. So lots of commonality between Agile and DevOps, but DevOps is more that cultural change and really focused on automation as well, so that you can have these ideas of sort of continuous flow and continuous experimentation and learning, even more so than in an Agile approach. Got a question here which kind of comes back a little bit to where I started. How is it possible to release small changes to production in a huge huge process that hasn't been totally improved or totally finished. And there's a couple of ways to answer that. First of all, in some cases, part of the solution to the challenge will be figuring out how you can break down the units of work into smaller pieces that are not dependent on the total overall process or the total overall change. And sometimes you can do that, and that's challenging, but part of the Agile process. Then sometimes, as I said, realistically in SAP, we're talking big, complicated end-to-end business processes, particularly if we're doing a large piece of development work. We simply may not be able to break it out and release those small changes immediately when they're complete. But potentially what we can do is deploy those changes to maybe a pre-production system or even a QA system, and have a means to show some level of functionality and some level of output to the people who are going to use it, try and get their feedback and validate what we're doing as we go along. And at least in terms of structure, if we're taking that more time-boxed Agile approach, we can gauge our progress more effectively through that process rather than just trying to do everything in one big chunk. What else have we got? Yeah, similar question in terms of how do you determine value of small items when a total solution is delivered over a number of sprints. And this comes to a question which I didn't really get into, which is how we estimate the amount of work that we should be doing in a particular sprint. And one of the most common ways of doing that is using a mechanism called story points. Based on our user stories, and that's really just a mechanism for creating a relative measure of work. And within our team, especially as we iterate through a few Agile cycles, we'll get a sense of how many story points we can realistically achieve in a given sprint each time we go through. And so we assign, there's various ways of assigning different tasks, different levels of story points to try and figure out what we can deliver in each sprint. And then they will ladder up individually to those larger epics. As I've mentioned, we'll associate our user stories with epics, and then we can deliver those user stories in chunks, and we can judge our value in a certain sense by those story points, but there may be other methods that you want to adopt. And then when we finally delivered all of the user stories associated with that epic, then we can say that the value of that has been delivered and it's complete. But again, it comes back a little bit to the art versus science of creating those user stories in a way that they are small enough and compact enough to be consumable in that sprint cycle. Just got time for one more question, I think, here, and I think this is again a good one, talking about the topic of team organization. What's the best approach to educate an SAP team on Agile if there's some reluctance? And this is a challenge that we often see in organizations we work with, and I'd say there's a couple of different approaches, and I've mentioned both of them today. One is if you have more organizational buy-in, more leadership buy-in. We have worked with a number of organizations who've really seen value in bringing in external expertise to help coach their teams in these new ways of working, educate them in what it means, and give them the confidence and reassurance that it's going to be effective and it's not going to have a negative impact on their day-to-day work. The other way, which we also see sometimes, I mentioned it just at the end, is starting smaller. And we often find that there's some appetite amongst some individuals to really try these new things, whereas other people are more reserved or more concerned. Perhaps you can leverage those enthusiastic individuals to form a small team and start with a smaller defined amount of work to really prove out an Agile process in SAP and show that there's value and show it can be effective and show that it can work within your team. And hopefully if those people are enthusiastic and open-minded to start with, that'll be an easy way to begin and help to bring the rest of the team with you. I'm going to have to call it a day there because we're already slightly over time, over our intended 45-minute slot. So thanks again for everybody, to everybody who joined us. Thanks again for all the questions you've submitted. Do keep an eye out for the link to the recording. And as I've said, if you'd like to follow up on any of these questions, do please feel free to get in touch. And we look forward to seeing you on a future Basis Technologies webinar. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.